In the autumn of 1887, in the windswept expanse of Pembina County, North Dakota, the settlers prepared for winter with the grim, practiced urgency of soldiers preparing for a siege. The land itself was an adversary. It offered up a brief, glorious summer and a bountiful harvest, but always with the implicit threat of a brutal reckoning to come. The currency of survival was firewood, and every man measured his wealth and his family's security by the height and breadth of the woodpile stacked against his cabin. They cut and split oak and cottonwood until their hands were raw and their backs screamed, creating formidable bulwarks of fuel that stood as monuments to their diligence. The common wisdom was simple and stark. A cold winter was beaten by a big fire. Among these sensible, hard-working men, Axel Johansen was an object of curiosity, then pity, and finally, open mockery. While his neighbors were felling the last of the season's trees, Axel was engaged in a project that seemed, to every practical mind, the pinnacle of foolishness. He was building a second house around his first. His existing cabin was small but sturdy, a tight construction of hand-hewn logs, meticulously chinked with a mixture of mud and grass. It was no better or worse than any other on that stretch of prairie. Yet he spent the precious dwindling days of autumn erecting a thin, almost flimsy-looking second wall of rough-sawn planks, enclosing his log home entirely, leaving a gap of about 14 inches all the way around. They called it Axel's Folly. They called it his wooden overcoat. Silas Croft, a man whose opinion carried weight, leaned on the new, strange fence-like structure one afternoon and spat a stream of tobacco juice near Axel's boot. "Axel," he said, his voice a mixture of genuine concern and condescension, "you're building 2 houses to heat 1. It's unnatural. You'll spend twice the wood for half the warmth." Others echoed the sentiment as they passed by on their wagons. "That's a fence around a house," one would shout, followed by a chorus of laughter. "Going to keep the cold out with a picket fence, Axel?" another jeered. They called it wasteful. They called it foolish. Axel, a quiet man with pale blue eyes that seemed to be perpetually focused on a distant horizon, would simply nod, wipe sweat from his brow, and continue his work. He offered no defense, no lengthy explanation. His only reply, when pressed, was 2 quiet words in his thick Norwegian accent. Still air. Their mockery was rooted in the logic of their experience. Heat came from fire. A bigger fire made more heat. A cold house needed a bigger fire. It was a simple, brute force equation they had lived by for generations. What they couldn't see, what they refused to comprehend, was that Axel was fighting a different war. He wasn't trying to generate more heat. He was trying to stop losing the heat he already had. Within a few short months, their laughter would freeze in their throats. A storm was gathering, a meteorological horror that would be given a name and enter the annals of American history, the school children's blizzard of 1888. It would descend without warning, a liquid nitrogen blast of wind and ice that would drop the temperature by 100 degrees in a single day, burying the landscape in a suffocating blanket of white. In cabins all across the territory, massive fires would roar in a desperate, losing battle against the invasive cold. Men would watch in terror as their monumental woodpiles became inaccessible, buried under impossible drifts, their fuel spent, their families shivering in the dark. But in one strange little house, encased in its wooden overcoat, a small and steady fire would keep the killing frost at bay, its occupants safe within a quiet island of warmth. What did Axel Johansson understand about the subtle physics of thermal dynamics, a secret whispered by the stillness of trapped air, that everyone else in their practical certainty dismissed as the nonsensical project of a fool? Axel's understanding was not born on the Dakota plains. It was a piece of ancestral memory carried across the Atlantic from the deep, cold valleys of Norway. He had been raised near Telemark, a region where the mountains were unforgiving and the winters were long, dark, and profoundly cold. There, survival was not a matter of abundance, but of meticulous conservation. Wood was not an infinite resource to be thrown carelessly into a hearth. Each log was a precious store of energy to be husbanded with the utmost respect. He grew up in a house built in the Stavlaft tradition, a complex system of interlocking logs and posts that had been refined over centuries. But it was not the joinery that held the secret. It was the walls themselves. His grandfather's home had walls that were nearly 2 feet thick, but they were not solid wood. They were hollow, a carefully constructed cavity filled with a dense packing of dried moss, sheep's wool, and wood shavings. As a boy, Axel had watched his father and uncles repair a section of the wall, and he had plunged his hands into the strange, dry mixture. It felt light, almost weightless. He remembered the feeling of stepping inside that house from a howling blizzard. The outside world was a symphony of shrieking wind and biting cold, but the moment the heavy door boomed shut, an almost sacred silence and a deep, penetrating warmth enveloped him. It was not the scorching, drafty heat of an open fire, but a gentle, ambient comfort that seemed to emanate from the very structure of the house itself. His grandfather, a man of few words like Axel himself, had explained it simply. The wind cannot move through the wall. The air is trapped. The trapped air holds the warmth. The house wears a warm coat, like a sheep. This formative memory was later reinforced by a seemingly unrelated experience. Before staking his claim in Dakota territory, Axel spent a year working for an ice company on a frozen lake in Minnesota. His job was to cut massive blocks of winter ice, which were then hauled to a cavernous wooden ice house to be stored for summer use. He had been astonished to learn that these blocks of ice, packed in nothing more than sawdust, could remain frozen through the sweltering heat of July and August. He saw firsthand how a thick layer of simple, worthless sawdust, the refuse of the nearby sawmill, could defy the sun itself. It was the same principle his grandfather had spoken of. The sawdust did not possess any magical coldness. Its power lay in its structure. The countless tiny particles of wood created millions of minuscule air pockets. This mass of trapped, immobile air was a profoundly effective barrier to the transfer of heat. It kept the summer heat out of the icehouse, and he reasoned with unshakable logic that it could just as effectively keep the winter warmth inside his cabin. His conviction was further cemented by an encounter with a local Anishinaabe elder named Chayton. Axel, unlike many of his fellow settlers, approached the native people not with suspicion, but with the quiet respect of one survivor recognizing another. He observed how they lived, how they built their shelters. He saw that their wigwam structures were not single, thin barriers, but sophisticated layered systems. Chayton, seeing Axel's genuine curiosity, showed him how they used overlapping sheets of birch bark over a frame, and then lined the interior with woven cattail mats. He pointed to the slight gap between the layers. "This is the breathing space," Chayton had explained through a translator. "It holds the air still. The wind spirit passes over, but cannot enter. The fire's warmth stays with us." This confirmation, coming from a people who had mastered survival in this very landscape for millennia, erased any lingering doubt in Axel's mind. The wisdom was universal. His neighbors, with their single log walls, were living in tents of wood, fighting a constant, exhausting battle. He would build a fortress. The science that Axel Johansen understood intuitively was a complex interplay of thermal principles. The settlers of Pembina County understood only one method of heat transfer: radiation. They sat near a fire and felt its radiant warmth on their skin. What they failed to grasp were the two thieves that were constantly robbing them blind: conduction and convection. Conduction is the transfer of heat through a solid material. A thick, solid log is a conductor. Heat from the interior of the cabin would literally flow through the wood itself to the colder exterior, a relentless and invisible drain of energy. Every square foot of their walls was a highway for heat to escape. Convection is the transfer of heat through the movement of a fluid, like air. This was the more aggressive thief. The tiniest crack or gap in the chinking between logs became a superhighway for cold air to infiltrate. A roaring fire, which they believed to be their salvation, was actually their enemy's greatest ally. The fire consumed vast quantities of air to burn, creating a powerful draft. This draft pulled super-chilled air in from every crack and crevice, creating frigid currents that swept across the floor. They were essentially living in a convection oven in reverse, constantly trying to heat the very air that was being sucked out and replaced by polar cold. Axel's design was a systematic assault on both of these thieves. The principle of dead air, as he called it, was his weapon. Air itself is a remarkably poor conductor of heat, but only if it is held perfectly still. If it is allowed to move, it becomes a conveyor belt for heat, a convection current. The 14-inch cavity he built was the key. By filling this space with a loose, tangled mixture of sawdust, moss, and wood shavings, he was not primarily using the materials themselves as insulation. He was using them to create a matrix, a three-dimensional web that would trap billions of tiny pockets of air and prevent them from moving. Convection loops, where warm air rises and cool air sinks, could not form within that densely packed, yet light, medium. This trapped, stagnant air became the true insulation. It was a barrier that heat struggled to cross. In modern terms, Axel was dramatically increasing his wall's resistance to heat flow, or its R value. A solid 8-inch log wall might have an R value of around 2. Axel's composite wall, a revolutionary design for its time and place, likely achieved an R value of 12 or 14, a 7-fold improvement in thermal performance. He was building a home that didn't just fight the cold, it ignored it. The construction process was a source of endless fascination and ridicule for his neighbors. It began after he had already ensured his primary log cabin was as tight as he could make it. He then laid a secondary foundation of flat field stones around the perimeter of his cabin, setting them about 14 inches out from the log walls. Upon these stones, he placed a new sill plate, forming the base for his outer shell. This outer wall was not structural in the conventional sense. It would not bear the weight of the roof. It was merely a container, a giant wooden box, and he built it with less than perfect lumber, rough sawn planks, cedar pickets, anything he could acquire cheaply. This, to his neighbors, was further proof of his madness. He was using second-rate wood to protect a first-rate cabin. The most laborious part of the process was the collection of the fill. For weeks he made daily trips to the small, steam-powered sawmill several miles away. The mill owner, amused by the strange Norwegian, allowed him to take all the sawdust he could haul for free. Axel's wagon, piled high with heaps of the fine, fragrant dust, became a common and comical sight. Men would stop their own work to watch him shovel the waste into sacks. He also spent days in the wooded gullies, gathering bags of dry sphagnum moss and raking up dried leaves and pine needles. He added wood shavings from his own workshop. He was creating a bizarre, heterogeneous mixture of organic detritus. "He's banking his house with garbage," Silas Croft declared to a group of men at the general store, and they all nodded in agreement. The assembly was methodical. He would build the outer wall up by about 3 feet and then begin the process of filling the cavity. He didn't simply dump the mixture in. He poured it in slowly, using a long pole to tamp it down gently, ensuring it filled every void without becoming overly compressed. Compressing it too much, he knew, would squeeze out the precious air pockets and reduce its effectiveness. Once a section was filled, he would add another 3 feet of planks and repeat the process. It was slow, painstaking work that consumed the last warm days of autumn. His most radical act, however, was what he did to his ceiling. The prevailing wisdom dictated that a cabin should have a high ceiling, at least 8 or 9 feet. This was seen as a mark of a proper home, a way to allow smoke from the fireplace and the bad air of sickness to rise and dissipate. Axel saw it as a cavernous, indefensible waste of space. Heat, he knew, rises. A high ceiling was a reservoir for all the warmth his stove produced, leaving the living space near the floor frigid. He ruthlessly lowered his ceiling to a snug, almost claustrophobic height of just under 7 feet. He laid new ceiling joists, covered them with thick planks, and then proceeded to pile a massive 2-foot-thick layer of his sawdust and moss mixture into the newly created attic space. This was perhaps the most crucial element of his design. More heat is lost through an uninsulated ceiling than through all the walls combined. He was putting a thick, warm cap on his home. Silas Croft, making one of his regular inspection tours of Axel's folly, was aghast at the low ceiling. He had to duck his head to enter the cabin. "Axel, a man can't breathe in here. It's a coffin you're building. Where will the smoke go? You'll sicken your family." Croft was a large man, a man who believed in scale. He had the biggest barn, the biggest woodpile, and the biggest fire in the county. He equated size with success. Axel's project was an affront to this worldview. It was a retreat, a downsizing, a project based on scarcity in a land of perceived abundance. "A man just needs a good axe and a strong back, Axel," Croft pronounced, delivering his final verdict. "You're wasting time on this box of dust that could be spent cutting wood. A bigger fire always solves a cold house." Axel, standing in his nearly completed home, merely looked at Silas, a flicker of something, pity perhaps, in his eyes. He held up his hand. "Listen," he said. The wind was picking up outside, a low moan that signaled the changing season. Inside the double-walled cabin, it was already quieter, the sound muffled and distant. He lit a candle and held it near the frame of the newly inset window, which was now recessed deep within the thick wall. The flame stood perfectly straight, without the slightest flicker. He then walked over to his own stovepipe connection, a notorious source of drafts in every other cabin. The flame remained utterly still. Silas watched, a frown creasing his brow. He didn't understand the demonstration, but he felt a disquieting sense of precision, of a hidden logic at work. Axel blew out the candle. He continued his work, ignoring the commentary, his movements economical and certain. He was not just building a shelter, he was conducting an experiment, and he had no doubt about the outcome. His quiet confidence was perhaps the most infuriating thing of all to the men who saw him as a fool. It was the confidence of a man who possessed a truth they could not yet see. On the morning of January 12th, 1888, the world felt deceptively calm. The temperature was mild for a Dakota winter, hovering just below freezing. Children set off for the one-room schoolhouse in light coats, and farmers went about their chores, commenting on the unseasonable January thaw. But Axel Johansson felt a change. It wasn't in the temperature, but in the quality of the light. The sky had taken on a strange, greasy, yellow-gray pallor. The air was unnaturally still, heavy with a silent, oppressive weight. He checked the barometer he had mounted inside his cabin. The needle had fallen precipitously. He secured the door to his small, attached woodshed, a lean-to built with the same double-wall principle as the main house, and brought in an extra armload of wood for the stove, though he knew he wouldn't need much. Around noon, the change came. It arrived not as a gradual worsening of the weather, but as a sudden, violent cataclysm. A low, dark wall of cloud appeared on the northwestern horizon and consumed the sky in minutes. The temperature plunged with a speed that defied belief, dropping from 20 degrees above zero to 20 degrees below in less than an hour, and it kept falling. Then the wind hit. It was not a gust or a gale. It was a solid, physical force, a tangible wall of moving air that shrieked with a high, unholy intensity. With the wind came the snow. It was not the gentle flake of a winter postcard, but a blinding, scouring torrent of fine, sharp ice crystals blasted horizontally across the plains. Visibility dropped to absolute zero. To step outside was to be instantly lost in a swirling, suffocating vortex of white. The great blizzard had struck. Inside the cabin of Silas Croft, the reality of the storm manifested as a relentless siege. The wind, moving at over 60 miles per hour, was a living entity, probing and penetrating his home. It found every tiny, imperceptible gap in the chinking of his log walls. Fine, powder-like snow, as fine as flour, began to spray through the walls, coating the interior with a crystalline frost. The sound was deafening, a constant high-pitched roar that frayed the nerves and made conversation impossible. Silas stoked the massive fieldstone fireplace until it roared like a blacksmith's forge. The logs, each as thick as a man's thigh, burned with a furious intensity, but the fire was fighting a war on two fronts and losing badly. The immense heat it generated was immediately stolen by the drafts. A river of Arctic air poured in from under the door and around the window frames, flowing across the floor like icy water. His wife Mary and their 3 small children were huddled on the hearth, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Their faces were flushed red from the fire's radiant heat, but their backs were dangerously cold. The fire's insatiable appetite for air was making the problem worse, its powerful updraft acting like a giant pump, sucking more and more of the super-chilled outside air into the cabin. By the second day, a new crisis emerged. The immense woodpile, Silas's pride and his symbol of security, was gone. It was still there, of course, just a few yards from the door, but it was buried under a 10-foot-deep, rock-hard snowdrift. The few logs he had on the porch were sheathed in a thick layer of ice, fused together from the initial melt and rapid refreeze. He spent a desperate hour with an axe, chipping away for a few miserable splinters of frozen wet wood that hissed and sputtered in the fireplace, producing more smoke than heat. Panic began to set in. They started burning furniture, a kitchen chair, then the baby's cradle, then the heavy oak dining table his father had built. Each piece burned quickly, a fleeting reprieve against a cold that was now seeping into their very bones. The temperature inside the main room of the cabin had dropped to near freezing. The water in the bucket was a solid block of ice. In Axel Johansson's cabin, there was no drama. There was only a profound and surreal quiet. The outer wall of his folly took the full screaming force of the blizzard, acting as a windbreak. The 14-inch gap, filled with its matrix of dead air, did more than just stop the flow of heat. It also deadened the sound. The terrifying shriek of the wind was reduced to a distant, muffled hum, as if the storm were happening miles away. There were no drafts, not a single one. The flame of the oil lamp on the table burned with a placid, unwavering stillness. The air inside was calm. His small, efficient cast-iron stove was consuming fuel with an almost miserly slowness. A single medium-sized log would burn for hours, its heat radiating gently into the small, well-sealed space. The heat was not being stolen. The insulated walls and ceiling held it, creating a stable, comfortable environment. The interior log walls were not icy to the touch. They were merely cool. The air temperature was consistent from the floor to the low ceiling. Axel sat at his small table, calmly mending a piece of harness leather. His wife, Ingrid, was knitting, her fingers nimble and warm. Their small son slept peacefully in his cot, breathing the still, warm air. The wood for the stove was in the attached lean-to, dry and easily accessible through an interior door. He had built not just a shelter, but a self-contained ecosystem, an ark against the frozen flood outside. Throughout the storm's 3-day siege, Axel maintained a quiet, methodical ritual. Every few hours, he would open a tiny insulated hatch he had built into the inner wall. It allowed him to reach into the space between the walls and check a thermometer he had nailed to the inside surface of the outer planking. He would note the reading in a small leather-bound ledger: -38 degrees, -42. He would then check the thermometer inside the cabin: 66 degrees. He noted the time and the number of logs he added to the stove. The data accumulating in his ledger was a precise, mathematical testament to his success. While his neighbors were burning their homes to stay alive, he was maintaining a comfortable 70-degree temperature differential using less wood than he would on a normal winter day. His vindication was not an emotion. It was a set of numbers, an undeniable empirical fact. On the morning of the 3rd day, a desperate, frantic pounding rattled his outer door. Axel was not surprised. He had been expecting it. He unbarred the door to find a figure so completely encrusted in ice and snow it was barely recognizable as human. It was Silas Croft. His beard was a solid mass of ice. His face was a waxy, frightening white, patches of frostbite already blooming on his cheeks and the tip of his nose. He stumbled inside, collapsing on the floor. "Axel!" he gasped, his voice a raw, broken whisper. "Help us! The fire is out! Mary! The baby! They're so cold! We're going to die!" Axel Johansson looked down at the man who had led the chorus of mockery against him. There was no triumph in his eyes, no hint of, "I told you so." There was only a calm, decisive compassion. He helped Silas to a chair, wrapped him in a thick wool blanket, and gave him a cup of hot coffee. "Bring them here," Axel said, his voice even and calm. "Follow the rope! Quickly now!" Silas, in a last act of desperate foresight, had tied a rope from his door to Axel's before the journey. It was the only thing that had saved him from becoming hopelessly lost in the whiteout. The rescue of the Croft family was a slow, brutal ordeal. Axel and Silas fought their way through the waist-deep snow and blinding wind, clinging to the lifeline. They brought Mary and the children over one by one, wrapped in blankets. When Mary Croft stepped from the howling Arctic chaos into the serene warmth of Axel's cabin, she began to weep. It was not just the relief from the physical cold, it was the shock of the contrast, the quiet, the gentle, even heat, the absence of the terrifying wind. It felt like a sanctuary, a pocket of a different world. Silas sat by the small, gently humming stove, speechless. He looked around the small, low-ceilinged room. He watched Axel add a single, modest log to the fire, a fire smaller than the one he used to cook breakfast. He touched the inside wall of the cabin, the old log wall, and felt not the biting cold of his own home, but a surface that was only slightly cool. He saw the utter stillness of the lamp flame. Everything he had believed, everything he had mocked, was wrong. His entire world view, built on the principle of brute force, had shattered against the undeniable reality of this quiet, warm room. His pride was gone, replaced by a profound and humbling awe. He did not offer a grand apology. His confession of error was quieter, more practical. He looked at Axel, his eyes filled with a new, desperate respect. "The sawdust," he asked, his voice barely audible above the distant hum of the storm. "From the mill. How much did you need for a house this size?" It was the question of a student to a master, the ultimate admission of his own ignorance and Axel's triumph. When the blizzard finally broke on the fourth day, the world that emerged was silent, white, and profoundly changed. The landscape was a sculpture of wind-carved snow, beautiful and deadly. The news that trickled in over the following days was grim. Lives had been lost across the territory, people caught out in the open, children who never made it home from school, families who had frozen in their own poorly built homes. But in their small corner of Pembina County, the story that spread was not one of tragedy, but of salvation. It was the story of Axel's folly, the strange house that had become an ark. Silas Croft, once the primary skeptic, now became Axel's most fervent disciple. He told everyone who would listen about the quiet, draft-free warmth, the tiny, efficient fire, the sheer genius of the design. The mockery that had once followed Axel was replaced by a tide of humble inquiry. Farmers, their confidence shaken by the storm, came to Axel's door, not with jeers, but with hats in their hands and notebooks at the ready. They were no longer laughing. They were listening. Axel, a man unsuited for the role of guru, was nonetheless a patient teacher. He did not hoard his knowledge. He shared it freely, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He drew diagrams in the snow with a stick, explaining the principle of the air gap. He walked his neighbors through the construction, step by step, from the outer foundation to the packing of the fill. He explained why the low ceiling was not a flaw, but a feature, why a small, steady fire was superior to a large, roaring one. He spoke of the warm coat his grandfather had taught him about, and the stillness of the air that held the heat. He was giving them not just a building plan, but a new way of thinking about survival itself. That spring, a different kind of building boom swept through the county. The sound of hammers echoed across the prairie, as families began retrofitting their homes, building their own wooden overcoats. They followed Axel's design, creating the 14-inch cavity and preparing to fill it. The sawmill, which had once given its sawdust away as waste, now found it had a valuable commodity on its hands. Men who had once laughed at Axel's wagon now lined up with their own, eager to haul away the garbage that they now understood was the key to their family's safety. Some adapted the design, using what they had. Those far from the sawmill packed their walls with chopped straw or the dry, plentiful prairie grass, discovering that the principle was more important than the specific material. The era of the single-wall log cabin in Pembina County was coming to an end. The following winter provided the ultimate proof. It was another cold one, with long stretches of sub-zero temperatures, but the terror was gone. Letters from the county doctor to his family back east noted a dramatic decline in cases of pneumonia, bronchitis, and frostbite, especially among the very young and the elderly. Families reported burning half or even a third of the wood they had used in previous years. Their homes were not just survivable, they were comfortable. The constant, exhausting labor of feeding a ravenous fire was replaced by a sense of security and ease. The health and well-being of the entire community improved, a direct result of the quiet Norwegians' refusal to bow to conventional wisdom. Axel's walls became the new standard, a testament to a hard-won lesson, a piece of practical architecture born from a near-fatal education. The legacy of Axel Johansson's innovation did not remain confined to his small community. The local schoolteacher, a man named Elias Thorne, who had watched the entire affair with a curious and open mind, was deeply impressed. He had taken shelter in Axel's cabin during the final day of the storm and had documented the temperatures and conditions in his journal. He wrote a detailed article, complete with diagrams, titled "The Johansson Method of Thermal Insulation, a Frontier Innovation," and sent it to an agricultural journal published in Minneapolis. The article was published, and from there it was reprinted in other papers and homesteading guides. The idea of the insulated wall cavity, a revolutionary concept for the time, began to disseminate across the northern frontier. Axel's quiet wisdom, born in a Norwegian valley and tested in a Dakota blizzard, had entered the permanent record. What Axel had created through tradition, observation, and intuition, modern building science would later validate with the cold, hard language of physics. His wooden overcoat was, in essence, a pioneering example of a high-performance building envelope. His focus on stopping air infiltration anticipated the modern emphasis on airtightness as a cornerstone of energy efficiency. The sawdust and moss mixture he used as infill was a forerunner to cellulose insulation, a common and effective material used today. His radical lowering of the ceiling and heavy insulation of the attic space demonstrated a perfect, intuitive grasp of the fact that the primary pathway for heat loss is upwards, the stack effect. His structure was a primitive but brilliant version of a double-stud wall, a technique now employed in advanced energy-efficient construction like passive houses, which use similar principles to reduce heating requirements to almost zero. Axel Johansson was not a scientist, but he was a master of applied physics, a man who understood the fundamental laws of thermodynamics in the most practical terms imaginable. The story of Axel's folly, then, is more than just a tale of surviving a storm. It stands as a timeless parable about the nature of knowledge. It highlights the conflict between the loud, blustering confidence of so-called common sense and the quiet, methodical patience of true wisdom. The settlers of Pembina County believed they knew how to survive, Their knowledge was based on a logic of abundance and brute force. If you are cold, simply make a bigger fire. Axel's knowledge was born of a different world, one of scarcity and conservation, where the goal was not to produce more heat, but to lose less of it. His story is a powerful reminder that the most profound innovations often arise from looking at a problem differently, and that true strength lies not in overpowering nature, but in understanding and working with its invisible, immutable laws. On the vast, windswept plains of North Dakota, where the winter wind still scours the land with its deadly breath, the deep and quiet warmth inside a well-built home stands as a lasting monument. It is a testament not to the man with the strongest back or the sharpest axe, but to the quiet Norwegian immigrant who chose to listen not to the confident mockery of his neighbors, but to the silent, unassailable wisdom of still air.